in Vedic, from the Vedic perspective, there's several rituals that are recommended. One is that one should chant. One should engage in like the chanting of prayers and mantras during an eclipse.
Any particular mantras?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean, this is coming from a perspective where that's what people are already doing on some level. So it's like it doesn't really specify. In other words, do your spiritual, prayers during this time.
Whatever they are.
You could put it that way. It doesn't need to necessarily be a Sanskrit mantra, but this is a time to engage in prayer.
Okay. That makes sense.
And then there's also what was it? People before the eclipse, it's recommended to fast. Two reasons for that. One reason, 12 hours before the eclipse, it's recommended to start fasting. One reason for that is the eclipse is a poisonous event, and so it's recommended to put a pause on the ingestion cycle so that you don't end up eating poison that you shouldn't eat.
Oh.
It's sort of almost like a metaphor. Don't eat right now because this is not a time when you want to ingest what's going on. So fast.
Fasting from other kinds of things too, like maybe the news and
exactly
whatever is considered to be mental junk.
It's an internalizing phenomenon, and so fast from food. There's also medical reasons for that Ayurvedically, because the sun and the moon are primary sources of like our, the sun is the source of our Agni, digestive fire, and the moon is, the nourishment. And since either one of those things is being eclipsed during an eclipse, it's best to simply avoid eating food because you won't digest it completely, or you won't be able to, be totally nourished by what you eat. So that's the medical wisdom behind fasting before an eclipse. It's also recommended to bathe after the eclipse. So before the eclipse, you fast. During the eclipse, you pray or meditate. Okay.
All right.
After the eclipse, you go bathe with your clothes on.
With your clothes on.
That is what it says. You should bathe with your clothes on, and that is kind of like a ritual purification of like any demonic energies and toxins you may have taken on during the eclipse event. It's a way of sort of purging yourself of that event, that inauspicious omen. Now I'm letting it go by plunging myself in the water. After you plunge yourself in the water, you should make donations to charity or something.
Okay. So can we do the modern equivalent, which is to take a shower and then wash your clothes in the washing machine?
Yeah, you could do that. Yes, I think that is a good modern rendering of it.
All right. And then the donations. Any particular kinds of donations? Because in Vedic astrology, there are particular types of donations that go with every planet. But what about an eclipse? Have you ever seen anything around that?
I haven't seen anything too specific about that. And I think a person could choose to, they just recommend making a donation. And that's their way of saying, now you need to make an offering that reconnects you to life, to the gods, because that connection got severed during that eclipse. So now we need to make an offering that helps us reestablish this connection. And you could choose a planet, maybe a planet that was part of the eclipse, or a planet that, you felt it really got affected for you personally during the eclipse in your chart. Make a donation in that manner, if you like.
Well, since this is such a Saturn-dominated eclipse event, all these planets ruled by Saturn and Saturn there too, perhaps a Saturn donation, which would be like taking old clothes, for instance, just an example, especially black clothes, and donating them to like the Goodwill, something like that.
Yep.
Or feeding the poor, or feeding wild animals.
Feeding wild animals, right.
Yeah, feeding the birds. I had a Vedic astrology teacher who always told me, feed the birds. Yeah, I mean, Saturday. So this is Saturn, so that would be the crows.
The crows, exactly. I was about to say the crows. Now, those are like Vedic, rituals surrounding the eclipse, their way of dealing with, it. And we already discussed why they view it the way they did. So that's not necessary. I mean, people can do those things as a way of kind of internalizing their consciousness during an eclipse and just being more quiet and contemplative and trying to just take the lessons of what might come up, But I don't think that anyone needs to have kind of a fear disposition relative to eclipses.
Yeah.
If people want to view them, people want to go outside, I think there's no problem with that. It just depends on a person's capacity and their disposition, you know? Don't be casual about it, you know? But if you want to, you know, go out there and do that, it's not like you're going to get poisoned, you know? It's just that you need to realize that you're throwing yourself into Rahu and Ketu.
Well, what's interesting about it is that if you approach it with a mindfulness that you're talking about, it's a chance, another chance to reattune with nature.
Exactly.
And that seems to always be a good thing for us.
It's always a good thing. You know, it's something to tune into and allow to be a process in our life. Because as you noted before, you know, eclipses their effect is said to last for 6 months, and then you have another one. So if you look at the year, you really see that you're always inside of the orb of an eclipse effect, basically. You could say that. You know?
Always.
So it's important to understand them for that reason, what these eclipses are about every year. And, you know, this eclipse is starting off the new year. And so I was just looking at it as, you know, this is really defining, you know, like how we're starting this new year with this eclipse is interesting. And I also think eclipses are kind of like the psychological shape of a year, you know? Like we can really understand a lot about what's going on in a year psychologically by looking at the eclipses that are happening that year. That's something that that's like a theory I have that I'm working on.
Right, and the elements, the prominent elements. And I just realized why the sorrow cycle is, would you say 18 years or 19 years?
18 years.
That's a Rahu Ketu cycle. I mean, that's
right.
How long the Rahu Dasa period lasts.
That's right. And 18 months between, you know, when they change signs too.
Right.
You're seeing that number, right?
Yeah. So it takes that long then for Rahu and Ketu to go all the way through the zodiac. Is that what it means?
That's right.
Okay.
So that's interesting. Good connection, Karen.
Yeah. So where are we in the Saros cycle? Does it start with Aries, or where did it begin? I assume it started with Aries, or not?
Well, it doesn't start with signs.
Oh, okay.
In that sense, like Saros cycles are just an astronomical measurement of, like, they're like the family of eclipses. You know, so an eclipse belongs to a certain family in which there's seen to be a pattern, you know, of recurrences.
So where are we then in this particular Saros cycle we're in?
This eclipse, boy, that's a good question. I should look that up. Like which eclipse number this is within the Saros series 122.
122 is okay. So
Saros series 122. There's a lot of eclipses in that series. There's still going to be more eclipses in that series after this. So it does us well to like grasp the nature of the Saros series for every eclipse. But there's also some Saros series that are relatively new or something. You know, it's like this is one of the, you know, early eclipses in that series. Or you'll have an eclipse that at times is like, wow, this is one of the last eclipses, you know, in this series, it seems. You know? There's a whole astronomical, you know, understanding of that series that's important, you know, to really delve into. Where does that cycle come from? How did they identify it? Why do they know that it's happening in this way? I mean, that's a whole science.
Well, okay, we can always go back to the 9 of spades too and talk about the meaning of that, because a 9 is an ending number, isn't it? It's like the ending of a cycle.
That's right.
And
so 9 of spades is the completion of a psychological cycle for someone.
Okay. And now the spade, talk about what that means. I mean, would you talk about what that means? Which I find interesting considering this is all earth over here, right? And what do you use spades for? For digging up the earth.
That's a good point. Spades are the most concrete of the suits. They really, you know, spades signify the body, the physical, you know, which, as you're expressing, earth, right? So it's very much in tune with sort of the Capricorn energy of this eclipse. And 9 of spades, like I said, completion of a psychological cycle. It's the spade part of it that indicates the psychological context of the 9, right? So 9 is, like you were saying, the end of a cycle, okay? Completion, resolution. That's 9, K2. Spade is something that has a lot of self-focus. You know, it's a very psychological suit. There's a lot of kind of crisis in spades, a lot being worked through. There's a lot of fire. You know, it's fire element. Spades is fire element because there's a lot being, you know, purified and transformed in the spade suit. It's like a very transformative suit.
That's really interesting because fire and earth is a very powerful combination.
And that's the combination of this eclipse. As I said before, Mars and Saturn were quite prominent.
Right, right.
You know, which we can even see in the card spread. We can also see it in the birth chart. There's a strong fire and earth quality to this.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking here, because Cancer is the home sign of the moon, so Rahu is not being activated as much. You're saying it's mostly Ketu.
It's mostly Ketu, but of course, you know, they're not ultimately separable.
Axis.
Yeah.
Okay, but because it is Cancer, its own home sign, it will bring up some kind of emotional thing for everyone, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I would say so. Like
the sense of home. I think Cancer is the rising sign of the United States as well.
Okay, interesting. I mean, that the Rahu and the emotional qualities of Cancer are going to come up a lot more in the lunar eclipse, appropriately enough, you know?
Yeah, so let's
look at that. But of course, an element of that is going to be in this. It's the whole axis.
Okay. Do you mind if we look at it just briefly?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Let's look at it.
The total lunar eclipse coming up on January 21st, it's the same axis. Though the lineup over here is a little different. The sun is no longer there.
Sun has just moved into Aquarius.
Yeah, the sun's moved into Aquarius. Mars is still there. Yeah, so there's going to be a total, and that's in the nakshatra of Pushya, which is really nurturing, ruled by Saturn, which is interesting. It's one of the foundational, one of the nakshatras that is fixed. Mm-hmm. The nakshatras have different qualities, like they're movable, or they're light, or they're fierce, or they're dreadful, mm-hmm. or they're fixed. And this is a fixed one in Cancer. Makes me wish I studied more mundane astrology, actually. Yeah, probably Laura Barat would have something to say about this, because she studies that more.
Yeah. I mean, what we can say about the total lunar eclipse is, for one, it's a total eclipse. So that's already puts it at another level of significance. Second, this eclipse is going to be visible in the United States.
Okay, I was going to ask you that next.
So if you're in the United States, you're in the shadow of this eclipse. Whereas the partial solar eclipse, I don't believe is going to be observable in the United States. It's observable in North Asia and the North Pacific.
Okay.
So that's another principle of eclipses, is that they primarily affect the places from which they're visible, or the places that are shadowed, so to speak. But, you know, it also affects people, you know, depending on how it crosses the birth chart too, irrespective of geography. But there's a geographical element to it. And this one is closer to home for you and me and others who are in the United States. And it's a total eclipse, so that's a major event.
Now, astrologically is different than astronomically, because I'm looking at this chart. I see the moon is directly opposite the sun, so that makes it a full moon. But the eclipse, I would expect it to be with Rahu. So why isn't it with Rahu? Can you explain to us why?
Wow.
Well, maybe not in astronomical detail, but it has to do with...
It has to do with the fact that a total lunar eclipse is defined by a full moon in which the sun, the moon, and the earth are in alignment. Okay. And it's the shadow of the earth that eclipses the moon.
I see. It's all right.
So that coinciding is the definition of one of the lunar nodes, you see? That intersection.
Okay.
It's kind of complicated, but maybe we can try to explain that.
Well, I'm not so sure how important it really is, because I think for...
It might just confuse people.
for astrology purposes, we want to know, how does this affect us?
That's right.
What is it do we need to know?
Exactly.
And I like what you gave us for how to really tune into it by fasting 12 hours before, praying, doing meditation, your spiritual practices during, cleansing afterwards, and then donating. That is I like that a lot. So no matter where it is in your birth chart, you will benefit from doing that.
That's right.
Yeah. And then if you have personal points on in Capricorn and Cancer and what? Also Leo and Aquarius?
I would primarily consider the Cancer Capricorn axis.
Okay.
Self factors, same thing I said before, but including Cancer.
Well, you know what's interesting about this is that last year's eclipse axis was Aquarius Leo.
Right.
And so now we're starting off this year's eclipse cycles in Capricorn and Cancer with the moon being opposite in Leo, opposite the sun in Aquarius. I wonder if that means anything.
I don't know.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean to ask a bunch of questions.
No, it's fine.
So what else you got for us? Anything else you want to tell us about this eclipse?
What I think is, in contrast to the solar eclipse, this is a lunar eclipse. And so it takes on all the significations of being more lunar, internal. And it's in Cancer, which is the moon sign. So that just makes it all the more potent, because it's a lunar eclipse, and it's a Rahu eclipse, and it's in Cancer. So Cancer is about the emotions, the heart, the internal life, home, all of those things. And I think that the lunar eclipse is going to bring up a lot more for people at an emotional level than the Capricorn eclipse will. I think that the Capricorn eclipse is going to be a lot more about reassessing a person's position relative to what they're doing in their life. How should they be using their energies, But I think the Cancer one is not really so much a question of action as it is of emotional processing.
Yeah, emotional security.
Exactly.
What is that?
What are the ways in which, I'm emotionally malnourished, or what are the ways in which I'm preventing myself from being emotionally balanced, emotionally nourished? What is the limitation on my feeling, in this moment, in this time in my life? It's going to bring up more at that level of things.
What's interesting is in the Myers-Briggs test, we back it up and go all the way back to Jungian psychology. The feeling function is considered to be a way of knowing the truth, just like the intellectual function is the thinking function. And so it's one of the ways to know the truth in your life is through the feeling and how things feel to you. Whether you're a woman or a man doesn't matter. And so that's one of the things that's making me think of. And so that's one of the things that I will be tuned into. But I'm assuming that you probably will automatically be tuned into this sort of thing because you're fasting, right? And that causes you to go within anyway.
Yes, exactly.
Because you can't really get anything, you've decided to fast. So where else can you go? Either within or higher, right? Higher up. So
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Jungian point, because another way of expressing what's happening with both of these eclipses is that the solar eclipse in Capricorn is apparently more extroverted. It's concerned with the externals of a person's life, how a person is related to their life in the external sense. Whereas Cancer is the introverted side. It's saying, how is a person related to themselves?
Yeah.
So both of those things lead into each other, and that's the story of Rahu and Ketu and the Cancer-Capricorn axis altogether. is learning how to manage life internally and externally, and being able to realize a balance between those extremes. Because it's not about like, oh, you should just work a lot in the world and get rich. It's not about, oh, I should just go live in the mountains and just like live an internal life and realize that. It's about, there has to be harmony between these two polarities, and Cancer, Capricorn really bring that out.
Yeah, that's true. Because when it's in that axis natally, one of the things that I tell clients is if their outer circumstances are really chaotic, if Rahu, for instance, is in Capricorn, then the way to balance that out is to go within. Exactly. And then when you're emotionally no longer chaotic, then your outer circumstances reflect that.
Exactly. And so with this Capricorn eclipse, the outer surface of a person's life who's affected by this eclipse may dissolve on some level.
Oh.
And in the Rahu eclipse, they're going to go inside and realize, what it is that they really want to be doing, or what they really feel, their right relationship to all of that is. And then a new external is going to surface from that. You see? Yeah.
You know what you said, something you said earlier, I would like to talk about a bit more.
Okay.
I see this as, rather than something to be afraid of, more like a chance to get a drop of the nectar, because it makes me think of the mythology of Rahu and Ketu.
Exactly. They got the nectar.
Tell us that. Do you know the story?
I know the story, and I recounted it briefly in my article.
Okay.
To explore the whole nectar-poison dichotomy. But I'll say it here, which is that, the gods are they're told in so many ways. One is, Vishnu is churning the ocean of immortality and the ocean of milk, right? And by churning the ocean of milk, he produces the nectar, the amrita, the nectar of immortality that, makes people live forever. So the gods were going to feast on this, and there was a demon present at the gathering, which the demon's name was Svarbhanu. And that demon is what we now know as Rahu and Ketu. But Svarbhanu tricked the gods, or seemed to trick the gods into, thinking that he was one of them and that he should receive the nectar of immortality. And right when he's about to receive it, he's discovered as being, a demon, not a god.
Though.
But a drop falls into,
right.
He swallows one drop before Vishnu realizes he's a demon, at which point Vishnu severs Svarbhanu in half, and so Svarbhanu remains fractured. And so there's a head, Rahu, and a tail, Ketu,
right.
of this demon. And it lives forever, but it's fractured. And the myth, of course, goes on to say that, well, I don't know if the myth actually, that very myth goes on to say this, but at least eclipses are understood as that demon Svarbhanu taking revenge on the gods for being fractured in half.
Oh.
So the severing of Svarbhanu is why, Rahu and Ketu eclipse the sun and the moon. It's vengeance. So that's another kind of Vedic perspective of eclipses as, again, this poisonous demonic event.
Well, I can see why it would become a fearful thing then.
Right. But you're pointing to the other side, which is like that there's a drop of nectar in these eclipses, which I completely agree with, and which is why I feel that eclipses are about transformation, opportunities of transformation. And if you think about it also, another part of that myth is that Shiva was present, and Shiva held the poison that came out of the ocean of milk in his throat. Because, see, when things are, in order for nectar to be produced, the poison or the toxins inherent in something have to be purified. So what was going to happen with the poison that was being churned out and turned into nectar? Well, Shiva consumed that poison so that the nectar could, be produced from Vishnu's churning. And he held that poison in his throat, and that poison turned his throat blue, which is why one of the names for Shiva is Nilakantha, which means blue-throated.
Yeah, there's a yoga that's...
exactly.
Yeah.
So, and Shiva, of course, is connected with Tantra and a whole other mode of practice that developed, after the Vedas. So there's those two things going on. And I'm obviously advocating that people relate to eclipses as a transformative process.
Yeah, very interesting. And it just makes me think how it can be an opportunity for jumping forward in spiritual growth.
Exactly.
The part of us that does live forever, the spirit. I mean, whatever part of us that goes through several reincarnations, like many, many reincarnations or incarnations, right? That part.
It's a purification. What's the point of Rahu and Ketu to begin with? They're a karmic purification. You know, they represent the force of karma in our life, the karma that we've, you know, of what we've done, and the karma of that which we need to grow into in order to be balanced, to be whole again, right? They're fractured. Yeah. So every time we have an eclipse, we're encountering a fracture in our own consciousness that needs to be resolved. And that's what we're needing to do. Discover that.
Does any particular kind of meditation come to mind?
No, I think people should just do what resonates with them, you know, whether that's just sitting quietly in front of a candle or whether they have an established practice. You know, I think people should do what's natural. What's a natural internalizing activity for them. It could also be writing. If the people are serious journalers or something, and they feel like this is a time when just things start coming up for them, they just want to write, that's equally valid as an activity.
Yeah, that's a really good time to do that, actually.
I agree. You had made that recommendation in past video about just like stream of consciousness writing.
Right.
I like that recommendation a lot, and I think it's particularly useful during eclipses too.
Yeah, because you're already encountering the unconscious.
Exactly. How are you going to process that? Well, this is one useful tool for that processing.
Right. It's one of the ways that we make the unconscious conscious, which is the point of evolution. That's the whole point. Path. Okay, so if you don't have anything else to tell us in parting, I want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation with me. I learned a lot.
Sure. I'm happy. I'm glad we could do this because I haven't really talked about eclipses in any videos yet. So this was good that we could get into this, and you had questions, you know, those were good questions.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to reading your article too.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to do an article on both eclipses separately also. So people just stay tuned to my Facebook and website and whatnot.
Yeah. I'll put all that down below.
Great.
Okay, so I will stop the sharing. And you know what I just noticed?
What?
Check out my shawl.
Oh, wow. It kind of...
Yeah. I noticed that at some point in our conversation.
That's hilarious.
Oh, how interesting. Okay.
That's a cool synchronicity.
Yeah, there's meaning there somewhere. I just know.
It's a sign that we're on the right track.
I think so. Okay, well, thank you so much, Neeshee.